So what we're going to do now is save our changes into source control. And what we're going to do this is to use Git, which is a very popular free and open source distributed version control system. And please do make sure that you've got this downloaded and installed on your computer. You can get it from git-scm.com, and it's available for Mac, Linux and Windows as well. So please do make sure you've downloaded this onto your computer. And when you do, we'll go into the terminal, and I'll just open up a new tab to do this. And inside the solution folder we want to do this. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to check the status of Git as it is now. And it tells us that we're not currently in a Git repository. So what we want to do here is we want to initialize a Git repository, and we can do that by using git init. And this initializes an empty Git repository. And if we take a look at the source control tab inside VS Code, we can see that there's 109 changes that are currently untracked inside our reactivities folder. Now there's a couple of things I want to point out here. Inside my Solution Explorer, I don't have a bin folder or an object folder visible inside VS Code, and that's because I've hidden them in my settings. And if I go to the settings inside VS Code and I go to the JSON view of these settings, then what you can see in here is that I've excluded certain files. And these are the default files that are excluded. But I've also excluded the object file and the bin folder, and if I just remove these, then what we'll see is that each different project has a bin folder and an object folder. But these get recreated every time we build our application, so there's absolutely no need to save these into source control. And if I look at my source control tab, I can see that we've got the contents of our bin folder and our object folder as currently untracked changes. Now we don't want to save those into source control, and I'm just going to exclude those files again, or those folders again, as I prefer not to see them whilst I'm developing an application. But we also want to exclude them from our Git repository as well. So what we can do, I'll just go back into Solution Explorer again, and at the root of our reactivities folder, I'm just going to create a new file and call this one git ignore. And anything we add inside here will be ignored by Git. So I want to ignore the bin folder, so I'm just going to add this in here. I also want to ignore the object folder, so I'm just going to add that as well. And we should find that our number of changes reduces to 23 in my case. There's a few other files and folders that I don't particularly need to save into source control. What's inside VS Code can also easily be recreated when we open our project in VS Code. So again, this is something else that we can exclude. I'll also exclude the ds_store, and this is Mac specific, but again, it's not something we need to save into source control. There's two more things that I'm going to add to this, the appsettings.json, because we might want to put API keys or something along those lines inside our appsettings.json file. And because we're going to save this to a public repository, which is GitHub, I'm just going to exclude this one as well. And I'm also going to exclude the database file, because once again, this is something that can be very easily recreated just by cloning our projects and then just running our project, as we've seen already so far. So now I'm down to 19 changes that are currently untracked inside Git. And what we can do, we can either use the source control tab in VS Code to save these changes into source control, or we can use the terminal window to do so. And initially I'll just demonstrate using the terminal, but typically I'll just use the source control tab inside VS Code, but you can use either method, whatever your preference is really. So I'm just going to open the terminal, and what I can do is say git add followed by a period, and then this is going to track all of the files that are listed inside the source control window. So I'll press return, and now all of these changes are staged. What I want to do next is commit these changes, so I'll say git commit, and give it a message and just call it initial commit in this case. And now all of these changes are committed into source control. But what we also want to do, so that we can easily share our code, or we can clone our project into another computer, we'll also use a public Git repository, and the most popular one to use is GitHub. So I've just signed into GitHub with my own account, and if you don't have an account, then you would need to create one on GitHub. It's free to do so. And what I'm going to do is just create a new repository, and I'm going to call it reactivities to match the name of the solution. And I'm not going to worry about a description. I'm going to keep it public, and I'm not going to worry about initializing this repository with a README. We can do all of this stuff later if we want to. So I'm just going to click on Create Repository. And what we get is some instructions on what we need to do next to get our code into GitHub. Now we've already initialized our Git repository and we've already committed our changes to this. So what we want to do next is add our remote origin, which is, and I'm just going to copy this line into my clipboard and head back to VS Code and just paste in this line to add the address of my new GitHub repository. And then what we can do is we can push these up to GitHub, and the -u stands for username there. And once again, I'll just go back to VS Code and I'm just going to paste in this line. And this goes ahead and pushes up my code into GitHub. If this is the first time you've done this, it will most likely ask you for a username and password for GitHub, but mine are already stored inside my cache, so it's already gone ahead and done this. And if I go back to GitHub and I just refresh the page, we'll see that the source code has now been pushed up to GitHub. And what we're going to look at next is creating the client side of our walking skeleton. And we're going to be using React for our client side code, and we'll take a look at how we can do that next.